Hi, I'm Marty Nemko. 39 Ideas for Your Career Success. These are tips of the day from my new book, Careers for Dummies. I've been posting them on social media, and I thought they might be of interest to you if I aggregated them. So, the first group of them is about choosing your career. And the first tip is keep your career exploration short. Many people take 6 months, a year after leaving school to explore career options. Well, at least across my many clients who have done that, quite few have gained clarity beyond what they could have obtained from a month or less. In fact, in general, they're more likely to remain inert. I've had many clients who intended to take, say, a year off, and 20 years later, they still haven't committed to a career, but just dabbled, often in dead-end work that they're unhappy with, but now find it difficult to get someone to hire them for a job that would launch their career. The second tip, startups are overrated. Many job seekers prefer startups. They envision a relaxed and nimble culture, and stock options worth a fortune. Unfortunately, more often, startups are chaos, followed by going out of business. Large companies have refined their act, and in our brand name society, it'll boost your resume. Next tip, this is one of my favorite new careers. It's called Be a Patient Advocate. It requires a Magellan to navigate the labyrinthine U.S. healthcare system. And most people, especially when they're diagnosed with a serious disease, aren't the best navigators. Enter the patient advocate. Your job would be to help ensure that the patient gets to see a needed specialist. You might do research so the patient's more informed at appointments. You might accompany the patient to provide a second ear and ask questions and check in on the patient in the hospital. You might sort through the bills and, if necessary, negotiate fees with the healthcare provider, the insurance company, or the government. Some hospitals and HMOs are hiring nurses, mainly and social workers, as patient advocates, but there's a significant unmet need that remains. So if you're an assertive type who and pretty bright and maybe psychologically oriented, you probably could do well in a field like this, or maybe a lawyer as well. Medical advocates can often get clients by contacting oncologists, cardiologists, and endocrinologists. Those are the ones who serve many diabetes patients, or by speaking to support groups for newly diagnosed people. Next tip, another career I really like, this is more futuristic, gene editing. Even attributes that were previously assumed to be determined by the environment, like political affiliation, have been found to be partly under genetic control. And at the same time, techniques such as CRISPR, which you may have heard of, are enabling researchers, at least researchers for now, to develop gene therapies for preventing and curing disease and, subject to regulation, enhancement of everything from appearance to intelligence and maybe even altruism. In the 1967 movie The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman received a career tip, plastics. Today, if I were to give such a tip, it would be gene editing. Next tip, combine an interest with a skill. A way to identify a well-suited niche for yourself is to combine a core skill of yours with a core interest. For example, an accountant who is psychologically oriented at his or her core might specialize in doing accounting for psychologists or counselors or coaches. Next tip, you want to go grungy? Many people have rewarding careers, perhaps surprisingly rewarding, in industries with grungy products like janitorial or toxic waste or post-disaster cleanup. But competition there is lighter, so it's easier to land a good job and to rise to prominence and wealth than in some cool, commonly considered field like entertainment or the environment. Next tip, status is the enemy of success. Business school encourages students to start high-status, cool-sounding businesses like high-tech, biotech, entertainment, and environmental. But high-status businesses attract the best and brightest. Your odds of success improve if you're competing with lesser lights. Status is the enemy of success. Don't innovate, replicate. Business schools urge entrepreneurs to innovate. It's easy for them to say. In the real world, new ideas, however, are too prone to fail. You could misread the market. You might have no comparable businesses to copy ideas from. And you've got to educate your market on your innovation. And if your idea works too well, a better funded entity could compete you into the ground. The leading edge is often the bleeding edge. guinea pigs often die. Deep-pocketed corporations can afford to fund many failures to find just one success. The would-be self-employed person can't. So I usually recommend don't innovate, but replicate. Now let's turn to training. The next set of tips are about how to get trained well. As you're looking for a program, if you're applying to a college or graduate school's career preparatory program, ask about the employment record of students in that program. Especially in fields like psychology or the arts or journalism, ask what percent of students who start the program end up with a career in that field earning a middle-class living. Next tip, get what I call Tech Plus. If you're a soft skill type, learn some relevant piece of technology. If you're a tech type, it usually helps to develop a soft skill, clearer communication, emotional intelligence, public speaking, etc. That's really good insulation against your job being offshore, because programming jobs can be done anywhere in the world. Next tip, working with a tutor is an underutilized and time-effective learning method. For example, rather than take a course in, say, a programming language, get a study manual or book of some sort, and then have a tutor start you off. You may find one at a website like tutor.com or wisant.com, or perhaps the instructor of some course who's teaching an online course. Then, keep a list of questions and problems as you're doing your self-study, and use those questions as the basis of the next tutoring session. And the final tip in the area of getting trained for your career, if you're a career changer, write what I call a white paper. When wanting to learn something that will facilitate a career change, you might read a dozen articles or so in which that you unearth from a Google search. Each time you find a nugget, so that's something fresh and not obvious and important, copy and paste it into a Word file. Massage your nugget file into a 2 to 3 page white paper that you'll title something like What's New and Key in whatever the field you're trying to transition into, and include that paper in your applications for jobs. The next section of tips from my book, Careers for Dummies, which was just published, is on landing a job. The first tip is, should you seek what I call a launchpad job? It's not a great job for starters, but a launchpad. An under-discussed career launching job is a receptionist at a brand name employer. For example, Google or Disney or Gates Foundation, even the federal government. There, the competition isn't as fierce to get a job as a receptionist. And once you're in, you get to meet lots of people who could catapult you. The next tip, you've got to walk in the employer's moccasins. Job seekers, you got to put yourself in the target employer's shoes. You got to ask yourself, would stating this in your resume or cover letter or the interview, would stating this make me more or less likely to hire this candidate? That's the question you got to keep asking yourself. Next tip, don't worry about your resume's length. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 page or 2 or even 3. Include any information concisely if you think it would make an employer, your target employer, more likely to hire you over other candidates. And it is better to spread the resume out over 2 or even 3 pages with plenty of white space than to try to cram it into a smaller number of pages. Next tip, use what I call a highlights letter instead of a resume. If your resume is unlikely to be top of the stack, even if an employer asks for a resume, it may be wiser to substitute what I call a highlights letter, which tells your key accomplishments and attributes that would make that target employer want to hire you. Of course, some employers are going to nix you for not sending in a resume, but when day is done, if you have a long employment gap or you're a career changer, you'll likely land a good job faster if you cast your lot with a highlights letter. Next tip, leverage your alumni. Especially if you attended a small college where the bonding tends to be stronger. Alumni connections can be powerful. Of course, you could access those connections through your college's alumni directory, but it may be easier to home in on useful connections at linkedin.com/alumni, because you can then narrow down with their search functions. The next tip, tap your weakest leads first. If you're a job seeker and when you're asking for leads from your network, first contact the people least likely to help you. That's because your first few reach outs won't be as polished. But when you've got your act together, then you can jump to your top leads so you still sound fresh. This is kind of analogous to a printer who uses cheap paper for the first few copies, and then when the pages are printing well, only then substitutes the high quality paper. Next tip, join or start a workplace alumni group. That can fruitfully expand your network. See, if you've worked for a large organization, even as an intern, but you no longer do, it's really wise to join or start an alumni group. You're really bonding. Again, it's a source of bonding, and you can help each other. You have common experiences, and one of them may exist in a LinkedIn or Yahoo group. You should check. As I said, its members will share an affinity with you, and so they're more likely to introduce you to prospective employers or otherwise be helpful. Next tip, get on a program committee. A particularly potent way to get involved in your professional association is to get on its program committee. That's who chooses speakers for local meetings, annual conference, etc. Because they meet multiple times. Because they meet multiple times, you get to know the members better, develop a relationship, and possibly get to invite speakers to the next conference, which is a great opportunity to interact with heavy hitters who could help your career. Next tip, maybe you needn't network. Most people need to network, but not all. Here are some possible exceptions. First, you could simply abhor it. Generally we don't do well what we abhor. 2, you believe your resume will, at least often enough, be top of the stack for your desired position. Or you're already well employed and positioned to move up. Or you've already made major efforts to improve your networking skills. You've tried them out extensively, and yet they've still yielded too little fruit to justify further effort. People like that might be wiser to focus on creating excellent applications for advertised jobs and not try to network your way in. And finally, you may just find networking ethically unacceptable. A case really can be made for networking being a ploy for getting a job you wouldn't deserve on the merits. Such people might want to try to land the job the traditional way, as I said, simply by answering ads responsibly. Treat interviews like first dates. You're both checking each other out. Read the vibes. Intuit what the boss will be like. Ask a couple of probing questions. If you're allowed, ask 1 or 2 during the interview, not just at the end. That's going to help you vet the job, demonstrate curiosity and interest, and you won't appear desperate. Here are a few sample questions. If I turned out to be an excellent employee, what would you hope I'd accomplish in the first week or month? Every office culture is different. What would you say differentiates yours? Every boss has a different style. How would you describe yours? And what should I know about the organization or the work group that might not appear in the employee handbook? Next tip, compress your job search. Job seekers, in negotiation, you gain powerful leverage if you have another job in hand or one or more in the skillet. That's why it's wise to do a thorough job search, all compressed into a busy week or 2. Reaching out to every prospect in just that week or 2 maximizes your chances of having another job offer at the same time as you're negotiating for the first one. That's also why, even when you're feeling relieved that your job search is finally over, you probably shouldn't stop looking. And when you have an offer, or even sense one might be coming, trumpet that news to all your leads. Having one employer want to hire you often motivates others to want to, maybe even at an accelerated rate to avoid losing you. You see, everybody wants what's hot, and that would be you. Focus on non-cash negotiating items. In negotiating your compensation, it's usually wise to focus on non-cash items. That's because the amount of additional salary that you wring out will be taxed at your top rate, federal, state, local. So typically you lose roughly half of what you negotiated. And you've used some negotiating chits because you can't negotiate everything, and the employer gets nothing in return. In contrast, if you negotiate for example, a better suited job description, the boss gets something in return and you get something in return. The right to telecommute for part of a week. You get to save the commute and your boss gets a fresher employee. Or a training budget, which helps you and the employer. As I said, in all those cases, both you and the employer benefit. And you're not giving back half of what you negotiated to the government. The final section of tips from my book, Careers for Dummies, is about how to succeed on the job. And some of these apply whether you're on the job or looking, as is the case with this first one. The first tip is ritualize. Ritualize a disdained big task. For example, if you are still looking for a job, you might start each day, with 10 minutes of procrastination, then 2 solid hours of job seeking, and then the rest of the day not worrying about the job search, and then repeat that each day, or 5 days a week. Next tip, maximize your to-do list. I don't mean put as many things as possible, I mean maximize your use of it. I want you to consider writing to-do items every night before you go to bed or first thing in the morning. And check your to-do list and your calendar throughout the day. The to-do list is these little items that aren't specifically scheduled for a particular time. The calendar is what's a specific time associated with it. Most of my clients say it feels comforting to check those items regularly so they don't forget something important. It also feels good to cross an item off the list. Next tip, keep utterances under a minute and talk 30 to 50% of the time. You really don't want to be perceived as long-winded. And it really helps then if you keep your utterances to under a minute each, and in a 2-person conversation, speak 30 to 50% of the time. Are you anger prone? If you are, you've got to avoid trigger situations and trigger people. If you're a hothead, rather than the difficult task of trying to control your anger once you're incensed, it's usually wiser to put yourself, as much as possible, in situations unlikely to trigger anger. For example, a job that has few negative surprises in it that you're going to encounter day in and day out, and with coworkers you respect, and having a personal life with people who are unlikely to trigger you. Next tip, you want to tweak your job description? When you're first starting out on the job, your stock is high. That's a good time to ask to have your job description tweaked to accentuate your strengths and skirt your weaknesses. Next tip, form a board of advisors. 4 years ago, I invited the 7 colleagues and friends who I most respect to form what I call a board of advisors. And since then, we've met monthly on Google Hangout from 7 to 8 p.m. Structure's simple. After 3 minutes of small talk, I ask, okay, who'd like to take the floor? Someone volunteers and shares a problem on which he or she wants the group's input. Group asks questions and tactfully offers suggestions until the person has had enough and then cedes the floor with, for example, thank you, that's been very helpful, who'd like to take the floor? Next tip, chime in last. In a meeting, be the last to chime in on an important topic. Your silence may generate curiosity about what you're thinking, or make some of the people wonder whether you're thinking at all. So when you finally speak up, your comment may attract particular attention. Also, by waiting until others have had their say, you make them less eager for you to finish so they can add their 2 cents. And maybe most important, waiting enables you to incorporate the best of what's already been said, and it avoids you making an obvious mistake. Of course, by then someone else may have made your good point, but it's generally worth taking that risk. Besides, it's not all about you. If a good idea is brought up, that's to everyone's advantage, even if you weren't the person who offered it. Next tip, criticism is not a dirty word. Tactful criticism, accompanied by a suggestion for improvement, is part of all supervisors' jobs. If your employees are in the office, you should be managing a fair amount by walking around, giving feedback in context. But you do need to strike a balance. If you criticize too rarely, you're not providing enough feedback. If you criticize too often, you're going to likely demotivate your supervisees. Next tip, give more weight to brains than to experience. For most, not all positions, but most, intelligence, drive, and being low maintenance trump specific experience or skills. Another tip for hirers, recruit by asking for referrals from trusted colleagues. Relying on respondents to a job ad is risky. As someone who's coached countless job seekers, on average, weaker applicants do more to hide their weaknesses. For example, papering over employment gaps and poor performance on previous jobs. Next tip, when you're hiring, interviews should consist mainly of simulations. For example, if the candidate's going to be running meetings on the job, have that person lead a brief mock meeting with the interviewer or interviewers playing the role of the meeting attendees. Also, you should probe accomplishments that are claimed by the candidate. For example, tell me the details of how you saved the company $200,000. You do want to avoid questions that can be coached in advance, like, tell me about yourself, or what's your greatest strength and what's your greatest weakness. Next tip, keep a time effectiveness voice whispering ever in your ear. I am helped to get a lot done by having a little voice always whispering in my ear, is this the best use of my time? That makes me conscious of time sucks, for example, watching TV for too long, or listening to my whiny friend yet again, or going to my second cousin's third wedding in Altoona. Next tip, procrastinators, you might want to take choice out of the equation. Given a choice, many people too often choose not to work. So if you foundationally accept that you need to prioritize work and contribution and getting stuff done, do you want to try to get into the habit of not even thinking about whether you should do the work, to not make it a choice? Next tip, use the 1-minute task. Often a big project's daunting, so it's tempting to procrastinate doing it. But 1 minute is a friendly, not intimidating amount of time. So it may help you get the ball rolling to ask yourself, what's my next 1-minute task? Do that 1-minute task and then force yourself to do the next 1-minute task and then the next. Often just 2 or 3 of them is enough to get you going. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. And finally, yes, be nice, but more important, be good. Many people smile, engage in chit-chat, and hold the restaurant door open for little old ladies. But when it comes to money or power, they choose expediency over ethics. Judge people not by easy niceness or what they claim, but rather by what they do when something significant is at stake for them. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope these career tips that are drawn from my just published book, Careers for Dummies, are helpful to you, and I do thank you for watching. I am Marty Nemko.